Good morning. My name is Patrick Hiller. I am the director of the War Prevention Initiative by the Jubitz Family Foundation. I would like to welcome you here in Portland, Oregon. Welcome also to our early risers in Hawaii who are watching us online today, and friends throughout the United States all the way to Connecticut. And of course, welcome to our global audience who signed up from countries like Brazil, Italy, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, all the way to Australia. So good afternoon and good evening to you. On behalf of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, the War Prevention Initiative by the Jubitz Family Foundation, and the Conflict Resolution Program at Portland State University, I welcome you to our special lecture and discussion entitled Engaging Rotarians in Global Violence Prevention. We will start today with Dr. Harry Anastasiou from Portland State University, who will briefly introduce the Rotarian Action Group for Peace and set the context for the main presentation. He will be followed by our main speaker, Dr. Joseph Bock from the University of Notre Dame. His main presentation is the title of today's event. After that, we will go over a few selected case studies with Rotarian involvement in peace building. And then Dr. Anastasiou will provide a brief wrap-up for us. And I hope everyone will be able to stay through the end, as we have exclusive interviews specifically addressing Rotary and Rotarians by Dr. Anne Frisch, who is a senior advisor to the Nonviolent Peace Force, as well as 1997 Nobel Peace Laureate Jody Williams. Let me introduce our speakers. Harry is a Cypriot-American social and political scientist and a recognized pioneer in peace-building initiatives in Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, and the European Union. He's a leading faculty member of Portland State University's Conflict Resolution Program, a longtime Rotarian, as well as academic advisor to the Rotary Peace Centers Committee. Harry has published 3 books, numerous chapters and journal articles, alongside top scholars in the field. Dr. Joseph Bock is the director of Global Health Training and teaching professor in the Eck Institute for Global Health and university-wide liaison with Catholic Relief Services at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Bock is the author of the book The Technology of Nonviolence, Social Media and Violence Prevention, in which he describes and documents technology-enhanced efforts, often on local levels, to stop violence before it happens in Africa, Asia, and the United States. His research finds that there's solid evidence of success in violence prevention and that there's still much to be discovered, developed, and implemented. Dr. Bock has worked for international NGOs, Catholic Relief Services, and American Refugee Committee, lived overseas in Jerusalem and Pakistan, and gained extensive experience in humanitarian relief and development. I turn over the podium now.
Good day to all. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today to give this brief introduction to the workshop of the day. As you heard, Rotary, the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, is one of the initiators of this event. So naturally, we need to say a few words about this organization in particular, and a few words about Rotary International in general. Rotary International, as you know, is one of the largest and most active civil society organizations in the world. Its clubs and its districts, they dot the globe. We have over 1.5 million members with 32,000 clubs around the world. The issue of peace for Rotary is not new. It goes far back into history, as far back as the 1920s, when, for the first time in 1921, Rotary included into its constitution the goal of peace and world understanding. By 1940, Rotarians were involved in forging the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that eventually became integrated into the United Nations. And by 1945, they were actively engaged in setting up the United Nations in San Francisco. Since then, Rotary has been involved in hundreds of peace initiatives around the world at various levels of society. In 1999, we had a highlight when the foundation decided that they will set up the Rotary Peace Centers around the world. These were programs catering to Rotary fellows who receive fellowships from Rotary International to study and earn a master's degree in peace and conflict studies. These universities, the universities where peace centers have been established, include Duke University, the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the USA. We have the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan, the University of Bradford in England, the University of Queensland in Australia, Uppsala University in Sweden, and Kuala Lumpur University in Bangkok. Since 2002, more than 700 Peace Fellows received their master's degree in peace and conflict studies and now doing formidable work around the world. But over the last 2 years, we had another very significant development, and that is the establishment of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace. It's a semi-autonomous organization, but embedded very deeply in the history of peace within Rotary. The purpose of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace is to pay particular attention to the area of focus within Rotary, which is peace, conflict prevention, and resolution. It aspires to enhance and deepen and expand the goals of peace building within Rotary and with partner organizations. It intends to help mobilize Rotarians for peace. It intends to provide the instruments for education for peace within the Rotary world as well as without the Rotary world, and to also help empower Rotarians and credible partners to engage in action that enhances peace around the world. Rotary is in a unique situation to do this. Why? Because it traverses cultures, it traverses geographical regions, it traverses religions, it traverses continents. This interconnection between Rotary clubs and districts around the world provides an excellent infrastructure for peace work. In this context and in this light, we have with us today Professor Joseph Bock, who, as you will see, will address the issue of how technology can be used as an instrument to avert conflict and to de-escalate conflict. So without any further ado, I turn the podium over to Dr. Bock. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I was thinking that this is my second time to Oregon, and every time I come, I'm thrilled because my son was a fantastic cross-country and track runner when he was growing up. He and 3 other people broke their high school record when he was a sophomore, and their inspiration was Prefontaine. And so I'm wondering if the Rotary Action Group for Peace will be the Prefontaine for peace for the world. What I'd like to talk about today are 5 things, and we'll go over very quickly the approach to conflict early warning and early response, which is something that the world has been trying to get right for years. I want to talk a little bit about the reasons I believe that Al and I started looking at this question, the conversation that I had with him. I want to talk about some of the unique, which have already been addressed to some extent, the unique capacities of Rotary. I want to outline what I think Rotary needs to do to proceed down this path of peace building. And then I also want to address some of the challenges that I think are going to be there that you need to deal with and to plan for. So let's start out here with the whole idea of conflict early warning and early response. Many of you probably remember the failed state initiative that Vice President Al Gore was involved with. And the whole idea there was you could analyze certain indicators poverty, of inequality, of rule of law and injustice, and that those indicators could help us see where there was likely to be violence in the world, which countries were likely to go into meltdown mode or to fail. And the idea was, as we identified those countries, we could then develop programs to intervene and prevent those countries from going into meltdown mode. Well, in fact, what's happened is that there have been some really wonderful early warning systems that have been created, but the response, the early response, has typically not been forthcoming. It's been frankly, it's been a disappointment. It was as if the social scientist dreamers, you might even say those who are plagued with post-Enlightenment hubris, and the innovative bureaucrats and diplomats and foreign policy experts came together to envision this idea of early warning and early response. And it was at pretty high levels. It was at the level of the UN, the level of the US State Department, et cetera, et cetera. And sadly, even though there were warnings, the responses didn't follow. One of the best warning systems was the one developed by Swiss Peace Foundation, FAST. It's no longer funded. It was supported for years. The group that I worked with in Sri Lanka was supported by the Swiss Peace Foundation. But the government of Sweden felt like the warnings were not being used. They were not being heeded. And to a large extent, it's not a mystery as to why. I mean, the reason, frankly, is because it's very difficult for people to marshal the kind of political support they need to deploy peacekeepers and to do so quickly. And particularly for democracies, usually there has to be a crisis before there is enough political will to take action. And by definition, early warning and early response is designed to prevent a disaster rather than to respond to one. So just structurally, it hasn't worked out the way that we thought it would. I mean, certainly there have been some examples when it's been done. The British intervened in Sierra Leone. It's kind of a unique case. We have a lot of hope that it can still work. And I would say that based on the work of Rotary and other groups, I think it's clear, it's obvious that it can't be purely a governmental phenomenon. It can't be a UN phenomenon. It has to involve people in the private sector if it's going to work. And that's primarily because of the need for local capacity. And we'll talk about that more as we go along. Okay, this is Sri Lanka. I'm sure you know Sri Lanka is right south of India. It's a beautiful island. It is considered by many Buddhists the Golden Kingdom. The overwhelming population within Sri Lanka is Buddhist of the Sinhalese ethnicity. The minority is Tamil, many of whom are Hindu, some of whom are Muslim and Christian. And I'm putting this map up because this is the map that I struggled with when I was working with the Asia Foundation, working with an organization in Sri Lanka called Foundation for Coexistence. And they had set up an early warning and an early response program based in the capital city, Colombo, which is in the yellow part of the map here. And they were focused predominantly on the eastern province of Sri Lanka, which is to your right. The red part, the eastern province, consisted of Trincomalee, Batticaloa, and Ampara. And they were keeping track of tension and cooperation in that part of Sri Lanka primarily. They subsequently started working on other parts. But there was a breakaway group from the main Tamil Tiger group. Many of you have read about the LTTE in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers. They had broken away. It was a separatist revolt, and all of the Tamils were a part of that revolt. But at one point, I believe it was in 2004, there was a subgroup of the Tamil Tigers that asserted autonomy from the main group of Tamil Tigers. And it's called the Karuna Rebellion, named after Colonel Karuna. And that became a bloody condition. The people in the north didn't appreciate the people in the east trying to break away from them. And so not only was there tension and conflict between the government of Sri Lanka on the one hand and the Tamil Tigers on the other, there was Tamil against Tamil violence. And it was a very sad evolution of the conflict. When I was going to the east, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time there, but I did spend time in Trincomalee and Batticaloa. We rode over to meet with some of the staff members and many of the partner organizations in those parts of the Eastern Province, and I noticed Rotary signs as I was driving down the road. And so here I am, I'm working with a group that's working on early warning and early response, and I'm thinking, you know, the people of different identities really need to start figuring out how to cooperate with one another and figuring out how to tame down the hotheads among them. And all of a sudden I see Rotary International, Sinhalese group meets at this time. Rotary International, Tamil group meets at this time. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of the Rotary in Sri Lanka. What I was surprised by was that Rotary, this organization that has civic glue, it is glue for many of these countries, it was bifurcating along ethnic lines. And it just broke my heart. So when I saw Al and he asked me about Rotary, and I said, oh, so you're a Rotarian, I told him about what I had seen in Sri Lanka. And that's the reason I'm standing here in front of you today. So what is unique about Rotary? I talked already about the civic glue, but you know, typically, and you know, I think there's no secret to the fact that Rotary typically has some of the most prominent individuals within its organization. You know, people who are prominent in business, politics, all sectors of society. They regularly interact. What is it, once a month there's a Rotary meeting? Once a week, okay. Even better, 4 times more. I've attended Rotary meetings a number of times, and it just amazes me how well people know each other. Again, the civic glue is there, pulling people together who are of different identities, different interest groups, etc. And this is something that I can't resist walking over here. I know Patrick doesn't want me to, but I thought of this word. I was working on this morning, and this word kept coming up. Rotary has the audacity to think that it can eliminate polio. Rotary has the audacity to think that it can bring peace to the world. And thank God for Rotary. It's almost done it with polio. I mean, we've got 3 countries where it's still a problem: Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. But an organization like Rotary, with its prominence, with its regular interaction, with people who have the audacity to dream, and then to do it, and then to fund it. They don't just talk about it. They do it and they fund it. So to me, Rotary has a lot going for it that maybe no other organization in the world has going for it. So I really like kind of the theme today is audacity, okay? That's our main theme. Now, when we talk about Rotary's unique position, we need to keep in mind that really what's needed for early warning and early response is not just the top level thing. You know, the failed state initiative, that was at the very top levels of government and of the UN and a lot of transnational organizations. And what is really required, as we've looked at what works with early warning and early response, is that there needs to be a multi-level capacity. It needs to be at the top, in the middle, and at the local level, the so-called grassroots, where civil society organizations, community-based organizations, service organizations work together along with people at the mid-level and at the top level to prevent violence from happening, to try to build a more just society, a more equitable society, while at the same time having the ability to intervene quickly if there's a problem. If it's got to be quick, it's probably not going to happen through the top level. I mean, that's what we've learned through our years of conflict early warning and early response. Okay, so the multi-level, and this is really the most important point, I think, about the capacity for Rotary to operate. It can operate at all levels because of its prominence. It can influence people at all levels because of its prominence. And it's got groups, it has members throughout the country, in places all over the world at the local level. So it can handle both the horizontal and the vertical. And if you don't have both of those, it's not going to work. It's not, you know, sometimes people talk about, well, it's just the grassroots. We need to focus on the grassroots. Well, that isn't true. Just focusing on the grassroots doesn't work. You need people at the mid-level and the top level who can exercise their authority to have influence in turning around these problems. At the same time, at the top level, it doesn't work either. We need both. So it's both the vertical and the horizontal. Now, it's also outsiders and insiders. And what's happening is that, you know, in the past, there were the outsiders at the top level who were trying to do early warning and early response, and they would try to work with some of the insiders at the top level to do it. And what we're seeing is that we need all levels. But what's really fascinating is that, you know, Rotary International is exactly that. It's international. So people from the outside can be involved in supporting people on the inside. I mean, we're even seeing now that people, they're calling themselves volunteer and technical communities. These are, you know, many of them college students, techno-whiz kids who are involved in supporting local people to understand how to respond to violence using internet-based platforms like Ushahidi, which is something that we can talk about more, but it's a digital map that allows people to plot events or assets on it and also to see trends over time. And so people, rather than the local level, I call that the cyberspace level. People from all over the world work in solidarity with vulnerable people on the ground using platforms like Ushahidi. And there's no reason, in fact, I would say that there's every reason for Rotary to be plugged in at all levels, but including the cyberspace level. You know, people on the ground, the clubs on the ground who can keep track of what's going on in their communities, and people on the outside who can be working with them in solidarity with incredibly useful situational awareness through a platform like Ushahidi. And Ushahidi, you can Google it. There's a crowd-based system right now. It's called CrowdMap. It's a crowd-based version of Ushahidi. It's all free. It's open source. And oftentimes they get people reporting events and about assets, events of conflict and events of cooperation, and they place those onto the maps, and those maps can be seen by anybody. It's an incredible capacity that's been developed. Now, I'm using religion here because, you know, ethnicity and religion are both factors that are often used for demarcating groups of people. And years ago, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, I thought, pointed out a really useful insight. And that is to say that people of one group need to be the ones who engage with the extremists of that group. It doesn't work real well, for instance, to have a Christian telling a militant Muslim that they shouldn't be militant. It doesn't work very well to have a moderate Jew telling a militant Christian not to be militant. It should be Christian to Christian, Muslim to Muslim, whatever the identity group is. People of the same group, particularly when theology is involved and belief is involved, when you get into a dialogue on the basis of that belief, of that theology, it needs to be people of the same identity working with each other. So I came up with this architecture. I call this, the communication architecture. And the white dots are dots of the moderates. The darker dots are the more extremists. So you have co-religionist gatekeeping. A friend of mine, Rick McCulley, and I call it that. You're holding the gate to the theology. You're holding the gate to the major thrust of a religious tradition, and you're making sure that certain segments of a sacred text or certain parts of a tradition are not being abused by the extremists. And so you have co-religionists engaging in a conversation, in dialogue, not people from the outside, but co-religionists. And you also are able to monitor what is aggressive by, as indicated by the darker arrows, because aggression is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, sometimes you don't realize that you've just offended somebody because you're not a part of their culture. You don't have the same religious tradition, the same experience as they do. So there needs to be a network of people. The white dots. There needs to be a network of those people who work together to prevent violence. That's a Rotary club. The white dots are a Rotary club. And they communicate every week. They're with each other every week. They can the ones from different groups can interact with the people who are causing trouble, the troublemakers. Sometimes the troublemakers, I don't want to demonize them. Sometimes the troublemakers have a really good point to make. There's injustice. We need reform. Our government is not working right. And it's a question of engaging with them and coming up with nonviolent ways to address injustice as compared to violent ways. And that's the important point that I want to make today. This is about engagement. It's not about shunning. It's about transforming, not eliminating. It's about working with people who see the world differently, who are struggling with some sort of pain, some sort of perceived injustice. Maybe a family member of theirs has been harmed or killed, and they're carrying that with them. This is not about we're smart and they're stupid. This is about we need to talk with them and learn from them just like we hope that they can learn from us. The extremists are not people to be shunned. We've got to engage with them. I mean, that's what we see over and over. If we don't engage with them, then it just becomes, either incarcerate or become violent. We have to keep in mind that the way to make peace is by engaging with people who do not necessarily want peace. So how can the Rotarians proceed? These people who have the audacity to think that they can bring peace to the world. The people who had the audacity to dream that polio could be eliminated. I would say, first of all, that a secretariat is needed. It needs to be an international one. Chicago, Portland, maybe Nairobi. I keep joking with people that Nairobi is the Silicon Valley of Africa. Ushahidi was created in Nairobi by a bunch of journalists who were responding to the post-election violence, 2007, 2008. Some of the most dynamic enterprises now, social change enterprises that use computer platforms are being developed in Africa. And Nairobi is the nucleus of that. There needs to be some sort of a risk assessment. Methodologically, in the world of conflict early warning and early response, risk assessment is different than early warning. Risk assessment is more like the failed state initiative, where you assess the risk of different countries going into meltdown mode. Early warning is if we don't do something, there's going to be violence within a day or two. Okay, so they're really different. at a macro level, at an international level, you can do risk assessment. Rotary, the Rotarian Action Group for Peace could form a secretariat to assess where the threats to peace are, the greatest threats. They could rank order them. Every month they could re-rank order them, because there will be new events, there will be new changes that are found out, and they could work with, they could focus on those countries and prioritize where Rotary can make a difference. And then they should have a team of people who can be, not to use a military term, but can be deployed to those places that are really struggling. And when those people who have the expertise to train people as to what to do, who have the expertise of how to use platforms like Ushahidi, who have the expertise to explain to people how to create events data from information that people might be sending them through their text messages, otherwise known as crowdsourcing of data, I think then we have a capacity that the Secretariat can provide to clubs all over the world, at a country level. Those people need to move towards building a nucleus in those countries. Maybe this is the wrong word, but maybe, I work in a biology department at Notre Dame, even though I'm not a biologist. So sometimes I want to show people that I know a little bit about biology, right? Anyway, the nucleus of organizations, the nucleus of the clubs, there needs to be somebody there who can put together a system like the Foundation for Coexistence developed, and we'll be talking about that with my case study. But there needs to be a core group of people in a country who know how to respond to incipient violence, who know how people can struggle for justice, can struggle for what's right, can stand for better governance, and they know how to do that without using violence. They know how, it goes back to this idea that conflict isn't necessarily bad. In fact, if there's no conflict and there's injustice, then you've got, in some respects, a bigger problem. Conflict isn't necessarily bad. It's a question of whether you want to deal with it in a constructive or a destructive way. If you want to deal with it with nonviolence or violence. And so there needs to be a nucleus of people that are developed in that country, assembled, and who work and focus on supporting the Rotary clubs who are in locations of a particular country where there is, the possible violence that would tear a country apart. They'll need to train people in the clubs, and then they'll need to establish an early warning and an early response system, just like this group in Sri Lanka did. And when they engage, this is the point I really want to make sure that everybody can understand this. It's taken me a long time to understand it. It's not a question of, as I was saying before, we don't need to shun people. We need to engage with people. It's not a matter of us, in a sense, bringing forward our own view of the world and implanting that in others. It's a matter of going and having a genuine dialogue. And many of you may have read Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is the key point, at least that I pulled from that book. It's a wonderful quote here about dialogue is a conquest for the liberation of people. It's not a conquest of one group over another. Now, this gets to my final part, and I just wanted to talk briefly about navigating the organizational challenges that I'm sure Rotary is facing and will face. First of all, the fact that Rotary has the action group option seems to me to be a really good one. You can kind of survey the boundaries of what's possible with an action group. At least that's my understanding of it. And I think it's great that you formed that, because there are going to be some people who say, well, this is political. We're not political. And that's another one of my points. There's a big difference between being political and being partisan. You know, in the international humanitarian world, I remember distinctly conversations at Catholic Relief Services when we started working on so-called peace-building projects, and we had the same response. We're not political. And we finally faced the fact that, in fact, we are political. We're not partisan. Big difference. We don't stand up behind a certain political party. We don't try to get certain people involved in, you know, running for office or getting elected into office. But when we say that it's not right that, you know, the Tamil people are being pushed off their land by Sinhalese nationalists in the northern part of Sri Lanka, and these people are made landless and homeless, that's a political statement. There's nothing wrong with that kind of politics. So I think there's going to have to be an internal dialogue. I'm sure there's already been some of that within Rotary. I think there needs to be a focus on the common good. There needs to be an emphasis on the fact that this is service. And finally, I use this terminology because of a theologian named Walter Wink. He wrote a series of books, a trilogy in fact, while he was at U.S. Institute of Peace. And one of the books is entitled Engaging the Powers. And in that book he talks about, you know, the way that we need to behave, again, is not to shun people, it's to engage people. And Rotary can do that. Rotary can engage people. Engage people who may feel that violence is the only answer. Engage people who are hurting because somebody in their family's been hurt or killed. And then Rotary can intervene to try to prevent violence before it happens. And in this way, Rotary can do what it can do uniquely. Rotary itself, the membership, the organization, the vision, that's what is really unique for Rotary. And I don't want to be, you know, maybe this will be a little bit provocative. I'm sorry if it is. But as I told Al, for Rotary to put a lot of money into master's degree programs that are kind of out there, we want you to promote peace in the world, to me that's like a shotgun approach. Rotary has a potential for a rifled approach. It has the infrastructure, it has the people, and that's its greatest asset, much more so than its money. If you're going to spend money on this, spend money on the secretariat, setting up the nucleus in those countries, and if you want to educate master students, then have them fill those roles. But make it directed. Direct it to this type of programming. It's not just about peace in the world, it's about the peace that Rotary can make happen uniquely. Anyway, I don't mean to preach, but thank you.
So I will step up here with Joe, and I will be receiving questions from the audience here and also from the audience who is online. And I will direct them to you, and then you can comment on them.
Sounds good.
Okay, the first question is, should Rotary or the Rotarian Action Group for Peace collaborate with conflict resolution experts to deal with a rising issue?
Yes, I think, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, the idea if you can nip it in the bud early, you're going to be so much more effective. And I would say that that's part of the whole reason that if you combine risk assessment with a secretariat and then you respond by supporting a country, the Rotary clubs in a specific country, I think you can get in front of the curve when it comes to problems. And so I think the early warning system in country is important, but more the risk assessment system at the secretariat level will help identify places where there's probably going to be a problem if something's not done. Right now there's an author, I believe his name is Sean O'Brien. He published an article, I believe it was in 2007. He's at one of the defense universities. I believe he's in the Army, I can't remember which, but the methodology that is out there right now is 80% accurate 5 years out. 80% accurate 5 years out. Now that's to me that's amazing. Now it's using a lot of pretty sophisticated mathematics, but they've gotten to the point where we're that accurate. Another interesting point, the British government's Prime Minister's Strategy Group did a study on risk assessment and early warning, early response, and their conclusion was that even if your warnings are false sometimes, if you intervene when you intervened there would have been extreme violence 1 out of 4 times, it would be cost effective if you were only that accurate. There's so much loss of life, of human suffering, of economic devastation that occurs when there's violence, economic meltdown, that if countries really did do early warning and response, and they had the capacity to do that, if they were only accurate that there would have been violence 1 out of 4 times, it would be cost effective. So you compare those two, 80% accuracy, 5 years out, cost effective, and this is for governments, who are expensive, and peacekeepers, expensive. It would be cost effective even if there would only have been violence 1 out of 4 times.
Connected to that question, Joe, you talked about the Peace Fellows, and in terms of conflict resolution experts, could those be the ones that would be involved directly? That is a follow-up question on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to say that the Peace Fellows program isn't worthwhile. I think it's a great thing. I'm just saying that don't just educate some people to be peace builders for the sake of peace. Educate people to be peace builders for the sake of putting them to work on this. It should be a more again. It's like the difference between using a meat axe and a scalpel. I mean, focus your programming on what it is that will enable Rotary International to be the most effective it can be on this. And I know that there's a certificate program that you've got. I think that's a great thing. Maybe that's what you'll do in country. Maybe the training that's done by this nucleus of an organization in country would do certificate programs. In the literature on using crowdsourcing, the question is in building a network of people that you can trust. They call it a trust network. Well, Rotarians should be that network. But they need to be trained, and you need to be able to count on the information that they send in. Their crowdsourcing should be something that you don't even need to verify because you know who they are. You know they've been trained, and you know you trust them. Mostly in crowdsourcing situations, you don't know who's sending it in. You don't know whether you can trust them or not. So you have to verify that information before you even post it onto an internet-based platform like Ushahidi. If you have a trust network, if you have Rotarians who have been trained, then it's possible to be much more effective.
Okay, the next question is, Joe, what do you think of Rotary specializing in early warning and then to be key in requesting early response from both Rotarians and other participating organizations like the United Nations, Nonviolent Peace Force, American Friends Service Committee, and others?
I think that that's exactly what it should do. I mean, this is not something that Rotary ought to try to do all on its own. If there are other organizations out there who are allies, by all means. I mean, I would work with them. In Sri Lanka, the Foundation for Coexistence worked with the Nonviolent Peace Force. worked with, there was a group from the Scandinavian countries called the Sri Lanka Monitoring Mission. And those countries they were there to monitor the ceasefire agreement that was in existence. And, you know, they would drive out there in their little Toyota pickup, four-wheel drive pickup truck with a huge flag, like the size of it, almost like the size of a bed sheet, SLMM, so that people knew that they weren't belligerents. And they would oftentimes stick their nose into things just to be an international presence so that there wouldn't be conflict. Well, those people are allies. I mean, we're always going to have people like that to work with. I think Rotary is the one that brings institutional staying power. You know, a lot of these organizations are working on the basis of paying people, of having enough revenue coming in. Rotary can operate with its members. You know, you're not going to pay your members to do this. This is part of the service of Rotary. You can operate with a lot less money than a lot of other groups can, and you can be much more widespread, much more penetrated in terms of your relationships. I guess that's what I'm saying. Rotary has this, you know, looking at it from, you know, somebody that after going through what these people did in Sri Lanka, seeing what Rotary can do, it's amazing. Their unique potential.
Here we have a comment that was sent from a Rotarian in Israel, and I will briefly read it and ask you to comment on that.
Okay.
Then. I live in Jerusalem, which is in a profound conflict zone where the horizontal networks of clubs is broken. That is, there are barriers to horizontal communication, fellowship, service, and peace-building activities between the Rotary district and the region. Israel, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt. These districts make up a Rotary zone, but depending on who is hosting the regional meetings, boycotts can occur. This year, our Arab Rotarian neighbors are systematically boycotting the November Zone Institute, which will be held in Jerusalem. My district in Israel has gained international Rotary support and resources, vertical, but no support from the Rotarians in that actual district, Palestine, horizontal. I believe that exposing our lack of horizontal linkages could encourage dialogue and intervention, and I'm hoping that your seminar can have an immediate positive impact in our region. I can leave that for you.
Thank you. You know, this is really an excellent point, and it's an excellent question. There is a human tendency, I think, for people to not want to work together with those if the Palestinians and others in Arab parts of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, the surrounding Arab countries, you know, they have the sense that the government of Israel is letting the settlers do what the settlers do, that the government of Israel is occupying that land, and that it would be fundamentally wrong for them, therefore, to collaborate with Israelis. And this kind of goes back to the point that Paulo Freire was making in his book. It's about engagement. It's not about shunning. And a lot of people, and I know personally from living in Jerusalem, a lot of people feel like, well, you really should not. Let me put it this way: I taught at Hebrew University as a visiting professor when I was there working for Catholic Relief Services, because it helped me understand the Israelis better. I mean, I enjoyed teaching anyway, but it helped me. My students were predominantly Israelis, most of whom were Jewish, some of whom were Muslim. But it helped me understand them better. But in that setting, it was so pervasive among international organizations to not even feel like they wanted to interact with Israelis. And look at the Israeli groups out there that are working for peace. So can Rotary help bridge those gaps to overcome that barrier? I think absolutely Rotary can. I think they should be challenged to. You know, sometimes when I talk with my students, I tell them there is a role in this kind of work for the naive outsiders. People who come in and say, oh yeah, you can work together, and they're sitting there like horrified, right? Horrified. But sometimes outsiders, and that's why you need to look at, outsiders and insiders at all levels. Sometimes the outsiders can really have a huge impact in some respects because they think things are possible. The people on the inside really don't.
The next question is, how do you engage an extremist who says, my way is right and your way is wrong?
That's a great question. I think that there are some extremists that you can never really have a transformation with. And if those extremists are propagating violence, if they're trying to promote violence, and there's no way to work with them, I think they should be thrown in jail. I think sometimes you have to do that. Of course, that's up to the government there, but there are sometimes people who are just troublemakers, and they have to be silenced. And so that's another great question. I mean, I think those are very difficult things, but that's the only solution I can think of, because I know there are people like that, and yet I would hope that we could at least try to engage with those people. And as I had put on the slide before, it's important to engage with the extremists, to just act like, those people are no good, those people are evil, to demonize them. Sure, they might be doing some things that are wrong, and you could say evil, but we all make mistakes. Who was it last night? We were talking about Dorothy Day and her book, The Long Loneliness. I was reading that book the other, not that I read it all that, I haven't even read the whole thing, but I opened it up at a shelter in South Bend the other day. It's a Catholic worker shelter in South Bend, Indiana. And the thing that really struck me in that book was that she said, on average, I make 7 mistakes a day. 7 mistakes a day. So I think sometimes people, they're upset with those who make mistakes, and we need to see that we all make mistakes. We all do stupid things. We all should be ashamed for some of the things that we did, but we've got to move beyond that.
Okay, the next question. We had a State Department officer pretty much tell us to stay out of their business. Is that what Rotary is going to be up against?
I've never seen anybody at the State Department do that. I guess I can imagine in a situation where there's a lot of negotiation and diplomacy going on. I think it's just like with anything else. The issue there is to identify allies. You're going to need allies within the State Department. You're going to need allies within the government of the country that you're working in. You're going to need allies in the police departments that are there. You're going to need allies within the UN organizations. I think you're always going to have people who are, oh, this is our territory, or people who, oh, don't be naive, or whatever. You're going to run into those all the time. I would say, think of in a Aikido situation, right? The martial art Aikido, where you don't, in many of the martial arts, you don't meet force with force. You step, and the force goes that way, and then you move on. So I would not let those kinds of comments or those kinds of people get in the way.
Please comment on the importance of elevating women to equal status in cultures all around the world if we are to have a peaceful world.
Well, I think that, in a lot of places it's been amazing what role women have had in preventing violence. I can't remember, maybe somebody in the audience knows of it, but there were women who, I think it was somewhere in Africa, but they told their husbands that there would be no sexual relations until they stopped fighting. And the government's, was it Liberia? Okay, so, I mean, women have a really unique role to play in situations like that and a lot of other situations. So You know, I think that sometimes there might be I think that getting women in positions of authority is also something that can help in a lot of countries. And helping women who are mistreated is also critically important. So I think it's a good question.
Okay, and for the sake of time, we will not be able to go through all questions. We will collect them all, and I hope Joe will agree while you're on the spot here to answer them afterwards, maybe when we communicate online, so we can really get to all the questions, because they're all excellent, and I was not trying to filter anything here. But the last one then for now would be, in the United States, and in the case of this viewer, so someone from our online audience, U.S. Virgin Islands, guns and gang violence is the issue. Can you talk about how early warning can be applied to our situation?
Well, I mean, we were talking yesterday about how violence is really the biggest disease in the United States. We have an epidemic of violence in this country. Yes, there are police departments that are using early warning and early response. They're using crime data. Their crime data are their events data. They keep track of trends. The one that I'm most familiar with, the system that they're using, it's called Hunch Lab. It was developed by a group called Azavia. They're based in Philadelphia. Robert Cheatham is the leader of that organization and a brilliant mathematician and strategist. There are programs such as Cure Violence in Chicago, where they are working with former gang members to intervene before violence happens. They did a documentary movie called The Interrupters. It's worth watching. There is a group at John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York. David Kennedy is the leader of an initiative, they call it Operation Ceasefire. The book called Don't Shoot that David Kennedy wrote is well worth reading, because it'll give you a real good sense as to how to deal with violence in inner city America, or Virgin Islands as far as that goes. Protectorates, or whatever the category is. Anyway, I think there are methodologies, and I think early warning and early response absolutely can be useful in helping us deal with the epidemic of violence.
So what we're going to do next now is we're going to move into the case studies that I mentioned earlier. We're going to have 3 different case studies and kind of spend about 15 minutes on each. We will be watching videos also for those. And then after the video, and you can also ask questions again, and we're going to have Joe comment and also maybe take your questions and integrate them into Joe's comments. So for the first one, I would like to ask Ray Jubitz, the director of the Jubitz Family Foundation, to introduce that study. And you may.
The video you are about to see concerning a peaceful solution to water issues in the Klamath River Basin in southern Oregon is an example of what one individual can do to bring about change to a situation that seemed intractable. Klamath Falls Rotarian Jim Root decided that bringing together people to listen and talk to each other would lead to better results. Players in this situation were the farmers, tribal members, and fishermen. He invited them all to breakfast. It turned into lunch, and they kept meeting every month for almost a year. Jim helped bring about a solution to the Klamath water wars through peace building, a very important component of being a Rotarian.
The debate up here is over what has been a free resource for a long time, water. And it's a shock to people's systems to realize that it isn't, not only is it not free, but it's not necessarily even theirs.
It's just a tense time. I mean, people are apprehensive about things. I mean, we're in a drought situation this year, on top of all the other issues, endangered species, tribal issues. We don't have carryover storage for irrigation purposes. Our storage is the mountains, the snowpack. And so when you have a year with low snowpack, low precipitation, that spells trouble, because that's our reservoir for irrigation.
A lot of this water is taken from the river. You know, everybody's competing for that same water. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people that don't believe the tribes have any water rights or have almost no rights for the water.
We've got treaty rights, executive order rights that say we have enough water to support this fishery, yet we never get that. We've been fighting over this water, you know, the water that we're floating on right now.
You know, we've beat on each other a lot, and we've competed each other in the media. We competed against each other for the minds and hearts of people. We've pounded on each other. We haven't solved each other's mutual problems. How do we do that?
Something's wrong here. Something went wrong here. How do we fix it?
The people of the Klamath Basin have been tied in knots over water for 2 decades.
To some extent, the story of the West. I mean, you know, this is one of the big Bureau of Reclamation projects, which on one hand brought huge economic benefits to the nation and provided water for irrigated agriculture, but the times changed and other values were there, and so wildlife refuges were established and hydroelectric dams were established, and no one did anything wrong. It's that these decisions all made sense at the time that they were made, but the problem is they overallocated the basin and created these bitter disputes.
At a Rotary meeting, the farmers from Klamath Falls came to my club and presented this issue.
What were the pivot points? What were the points in time when things really changed? One of those times was during what was called the Shiloh Root meetings.
And sent out an invitation to people on all sides of the issue, the water issue.
Shiloh was an attempt to bring people into a room where they could talk confidentially and try to hammer some things out.
We agreed to meet for once a month, and this went on for 9 months. Meetings going about 8 hours per session.
We were all fighting each other, and the only time we talked was in a courtroom or through a dueling press release. And guess what? None of us were winning. They weren't winning. We weren't winning. Everybody was still uncertain with water supply.
I simply addressed what issues were on both sides, offering no solution. Just these are the things that I'm aware of that we should be talking about.
It came in stages. You know, I think it almost had to have that process.
We're in the room, and the farmers, after they'd had their water shut off in 2001, were obviously so upset that it took us years to really reconvene in a way that was meaningful. We lost years of time.
In other words, we had conflict, we have tension, we that have tension with each other start to interact.
But the side conversations started as we were dining. And that then set the stage for an open dialogue.
We had come back to the table and been in meetings for a long, long time, and we had reached this point where the farmers in the room, some of these guys are friends of mine, were actually honestly asking Alan Foreman, who was the chairman of the Klamath Tribes at that time, what is it that, you know, how are we going to make this right?
Not like we just woke up one morning and say, let's settle this thing, but you find yourself in different forums with different people, with people who have a lot to do with your ability to irrigate, and you start talking. It becomes a very human thing at that point. You know, it's about the people who depend on the resource, whether it's fishermen, tribes, farmers.
And that's where the ideas were put forward, negotiated, and assembled that gave a framework for the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement.
KBRA is more about all of us sitting at the table, and not necessarily arm twisting, but realizing that together we can get away from the arm twisting, from the legal battles, from the things that give us uncertainty, try to give us some certainty for the future so that my 6-year-old son has the opportunity to come back here and do what I'm doing.
You know, in a normal year, if we just cut back 15%, maybe 20% of the water, we'd have enough water for everybody.
And I said to Chairman Foreman, I said, what would it mean if somebody just said they were sorry? And he started to tear up in this meeting. It was mostly men, you know, it was like probably 15, 20 people in this room. He started to tear up and he said, that would be worth $1 million. And it was an incredible moment in time.
The small start that we had with a Rotary concept that I saw 20 years ago has now led to putting us at the cusp of accomplishing peace in the Klamath Basin and embarking on the greatest conservation project in this country's history.
So in the nature of Joe's earlier comments that he shared with us on his ideas on Rotary, I would like to ask Joe again to share with us really his initial thoughts on having seen this video and that effort done by a Rotarian. And if I could ask you to. And if the audience has questions, we're still collecting them. And now we're looking at this specific case.
Well, I guess Patrick's not going to let me eat my muffin today. I think it's an interesting case. It's an example of somebody taking the initiative to pull people together. From what I understand, it's a rather challenging issue from the standpoint of treaties with the Native Americans and the rights that they are afforded because of the treaties. So I feel like the beginning step that has already been done is excellent. I think that there might be some, details that need to be worked out, and that's when, Rotarians with their governments, with the influence that they have, can bring people together at other levels as well. They're getting the farmers together. They're getting the people of the Native American tribes together. They might need to bring in county officials, and maybe they already have, maybe state officials, maybe even federal officials, to work out some of the details here relative to the treaties and the legal rights that the Native Americans have, the riparian rights that the farmers may have, et cetera. So I think that it's an example of Rotary having the ability to convene. It's convening power. And I think that's something that people in prominent circumstances who have relationships horizontally as well as vertically are able to do.
Thank you, Joe. We have no questions specifically to this case study right now, so we will move in there will be one in the audience.
Yeah. I think this piece is about possibility. If we can do it here, we can do it there and everywhere. So it's an inspirational piece that reminds us peace can happen.
For the online audience, this is an inspirational piece that peace can happen. It's about possibilities, in case you didn't get the audio. So what we're going to do now is move into the next case study, which is, on a project in Uganda by two Rotary Peace Fellows who, after finishing their master's program at the University of Queensland, the names are Robert Opira and Godfrey Mukalasi, they founded the Great Lakes Center for Conflict Resolution in Gulu, Uganda. So we'll do the same thing. We'll watch a brief video that they sent to us specifically for this event today, and then we'll ask Joe to comment again. I'm probably going to interrupt him again while he's eating his second half of his muffin.
So we had this lady, Nakiru. She is a widow. With 4 daughters. Her husband was shot dead. And of course, she had been very, very hard on the girls.
This is a great opportunity to see how Rotary International is linking up with other civil societies to work within the communities to create smiles to the faces of many people who are suffering in various communities, various countries. And actually, this is a response to a call by a Rotary president who called Rotarians to work hand in hand with the Rotary Peace Fellows to promote peace all over the world.
So on the first day, as part of her exercise, she went home and she just greeted these girls nicely. How have you been? And how was the day? How's your life? And the girls were like, what's wrong with mommy?
It's often said that peace is a prerequisite for development. But as a Rotarian, but as a woman, I think having social justice and having development is a prerequisite to peace.
Vulnerability for conflict sometimes is high, especially in a community where you don't have too much to work with or too much to share. So there's a very strong likelihood of conflicting over either resources, over power, over responsibilities.
So after they ate dinner, they went to sleep. But the elder one came to wake her up after midnight and said, Mommy, what's wrong with you? She said, why? You have never talked to us like this. You had never come from anywhere and greet us. Every time you come back, you want to beat us, even when we have done nothing. So what has happened to you? She said, no, something must have happened to you because this has never been your behavior. So she said, well, something has happened today.
We need peace in the world.
I thought it would be good for me to come and learn the different contexts of conflict with the other members of the team. I'm very hopeful that in the near future we'll have total peace in Uganda.
I believe and I know it so that without peace, no development.
We had this training in psychosocial support and we realized that we are traumatized. And we realized that all of us are taking the trauma onto the people we live with. So I had an assignment to come and be different and be nice to you. The girl said, how long is this training? Are you going to continue? Is this going to change you forever? She said, yes, I have realized that I have been hard on you, and this is very unfortunate, but now we need to talk as a family. And the girls were like, wow. And the next morning, the girls were running all over the village saying, our mother has gone for a course which has transformed her forever.
We are the chosen generation. We are the meant to make peace. Let unity and freedom be the banner of love. Let common and peace each other. How we for peace to all. Let common and peace each other. How we for peace to all. We are the chosen generation. We are the mandate to make peace. Let unity and freedom.
Okay, Joe just walked up again, so I would like to ask you again to comment on that video and what you saw there.
Well, I think two things that are important in this video. One is that one of the speakers emphasized the importance of working towards justice. If you're going to have peace, you have to work towards justice, and that's really what we have to keep in mind. When there are injustices, it's very difficult to say we just need to get along. And people need to see that there are concrete measures being taken in the direction of justice. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that in a lot of instances, the humanities are helpful. Art, music, poetry. And in India, there was a group there I worked with called the St. Xavier Social Services Society. They use drama troupes in the slums to help people see how riots were often instigated by people who would benefit from those riots. Could be land developers who wanted people to be off the land. If there was a riot, they would vacate the area and then they would bulldoze down all of the shacks in the slum and reclaim the property. So these plays were done in such a way that it was kind of like, let's not be so stupid as to let these people manipulate us into killing each other. Because the reason that they're doing this is because they want to build a building here. So I think that art is a very useful part of these kinds of things, and it may be the kind of thing that Rotary clubs could sponsor, a poetry contest on how we can bring justice to our nation, drama troupes who can get messages out in some of the remote parts of the community, music that can be inspirational. These things they're hard, and the humanities can help us, I think, to envision and to move hearts and minds in ways that just words sometimes can't.
Thank you, Joe. What we're going to do now is move into the third case study, which will be one that Joe also already prepared for us. He already mentioned Sri Lanka, and he's going to spend a little bit more time now on what he wanted to share with us there. And if we have time in the end, we can revisit the initial questions that we didn't address and also some that came up for the case studies. But now I'll give it microphone back to Joe to the case example of Sri Lanka.
Well, the situation in Sri Lanka, as I explained earlier, there have been. It was about 30 years, if I'm correct, that there was this separatist revolt on the island of Ceylon, which we now call Sri Lanka. Think of these people every time you drink tea and you see Ceylon on your tea bag, because that's where it comes from. And I was just thinking back there when I was eating one of those delicious muffins, I was thinking about some of the people in Sri Lanka that I saw after the tsunami. This whole thing is all about global solidarity. And I never will forget, there were families, they had they were kind of like tillers, but they're two-wheeled machines that had power going to both wheels. There weren't two other wheels, but they would hook up trailers that had two other wheels to these tillers. And they loaded the trailers up with whatever food they had, and they drove those things all the way across the island to help people who had suffered from the tsunami. And they had solidarity for those people, and they were so determined to help those people that they gave up what little food that they had to help the people on the other side of the island. So it's that type of generosity and determination that I think compels Rotary. You know, people may be on the other side of the world, but you're going to jump into your tiller that maybe goes 2 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour at the most, and you're going to take what little food you've got to help them, to help people on the other side. So to me, the people of Sri Lanka were just an amazing inspiration, and I do want to clarify that whatever I know about conflict early warning and early response is because of the people in Sri Lanka. They're the ones who taught me. We talked about conflict can either be destructive or constructive, violent or not violent. And I want to just mention real quickly, those of you who know what it's like to trade stocks, a lot of times people realize that, you know, there are different kinds of indicators. Fundamental indicators or structural indicators are things like, you know, the profitability of a company, price to earnings ratio, etc. But there are technical indicators that are more like momentum. You know, how many people are buying the stock and where is the price going? And those are the kinds of things that day traders look for. Conflict early warning and early response is more like being a day trader than a long-term investor. A long-term investor are the ones who do risk analysis, like we were talking about before. So just keep the day traders in mind, the people that buy stock and sell it quickly trying to make a profit. They're looking at very dynamic things that are happening in a relatively short period of time, and they're looking for acute changes over time. So in the world of violence prevention, structural prevention is addressing the injustices. Operational prevention is preventing violence before it happens. It's responding to incipient violence. You have to be there in a timely way. It's nipping violence in the bud. So keep in mind that Rotary will want to focus on structural prevention as well as operational prevention. But as I tell, you know, students that I talk with about this, if you were going to build a building, wouldn't you put in a fire suppression system? You know, if you're going to try to build a just society that has the rule of law, that where people aren't discriminated against, where everybody has equal opportunity, you can focus on structural prevention like that. But wouldn't you also put in an early warning system? If things start getting bad, you can respond to them. Sri Lanka was one of 4 of the Asian tigers that I studied when I studied economic development. It was one of 4 Asian tigers. There was South Korea, Taiwan, Sri Lanka was the other, and I can't remember the 4th one. But it was a growth with equity success story. It was a success story of high literacy, of excellent health indicators, even with low income per capita. It was one of the Asian tigers, and it melted down into economic malaise over 30 years of violence. And there was a history of discrimination, a history of the Tamil people feeling like they were second-class citizens. There were some Tamil troublemakers who killed some police officers. And then the government, the people in authority, told the police officers that they needed to teach the Tamils a lesson, and that it got out of hand. And, you know, it became very violent. And at that point, the insurgency, the separatist revolt was initiated. So having an early warning and early response system is important. It's just as important as when you build a building, you want to put sprinklers into it. When you build a city, you want a fire department in it. When you build a society, that has significant tension, you better get an early warning and an early response system in place that's effective. This is the, in the case of Sri Lanka, I had read a book called The Deadly Ethnic Riot by Donald Horowitz. He published it in 2001. And in that, he outlined something that's really an amazing insight, and that is that there are social psychological processes that occur when people are building consensus to become violent. You know, killing other human beings certainly is not an easy thing. It's really, I would say, not a natural thing. People build consensus. They develop a collective understanding of what they have to do. And so an early warning system needs to be capable of identifying events that indicate that this is happening, or signals that indicate that this is happening. And so there are underlying conditions, many of which can be dealt with in a structural way. And then oftentimes there's a precipitating event. In Sri Lanka, the precipitating event was that protest where lots of Tamils were basically slaughtered by the police. That was a precipitating event. Then there's a lull, a period of time where consensus building is taking place before violence happens. And during that period of time, there is acute emotional engagement, a sense that it's justifiable to kill others, an exaggeration of the threat that's posed by the other group, a sense that we don't have any risk in attacking them, and then a sense that we don't have any other options. Sometimes we need, as I said, we need to keep track of events. Someone's been harassed at a checkpoint, or we need to keep track of signals. And an example that I heard of in Lebanon of signals was when children of different ethnic groups, of different ethno-religious groups, aren't playing together at recess when they normally do, then something is brewing. Consensus building is taking place. There's likely to be violence. So you're looking at both events and signals when you're developing an early warning system. And you can crowdsource, oh, you know, somebody said that when the little kids aren't playing together at recess, we should send in a text message. You're crowdsourcing information that will help you understand where violence is likely to erupt and when. This is a sequence: increasing tension, moving towards a precipitating event. You start seeing signals and events during the lull, and then you get violence. Okay? So the early warning system needs to be detecting. You keep track of tensions building, you identify precipitating events, and then you take initiatives in the right places with the right people in order to prevent the violence from happening. The question that I was struggling with when I was there is, how long is the lull? How long do you have? Okay, so we're using the Al Gore's failed state methodology. I'm sorry, we're sitting in Washington, D.C. You know, something just happened on the ground in Sri Lanka. How much time do you have to respond to it? These are the events data, some of the actual events data that was put together by the Foundation for Coexistence. And it has to respond to who did what, to whom, where. And in this case, we have major events, sub-events, who initiated it, the Sri Lankan Army, the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, who was a recipient, civilians, youths, how many injuries there were, how many deaths there were, what kind of damage was done to property, was the information about this event credible or not, and who was the source of it. Was it the media? Was it somebody who called in? Was it one of your staff members who sent in the information? All of these data were collected. After a 4-year period, they had collected 24,000 events. And they had produced reports for people at all levels, people locally that were running non-governmental organizations, people at the mid-level who were, say, in the county government, the provincial government rather, and then people at the very top, including government officials, Army officials, officials within the Tamil Tigers, diplomats from the outside, UN officials. They would compile reports on the basis of what they were seeing in terms of trends of the data and locations of those trends, and they would essentially assess this. There's a great deal of tension in this community, and there needs to be we need to be careful so that it doesn't become violent. And we interviewed. I had I had two other people who I had working with me on this project, and we interviewed quite a few of the people who were recipients of these reports, and they really found them helpful. I mean, think about basically all of the white noise out there when you're in a situation like in Sri Lanka where there's regular violence along ethnic lines. It's like noise. It's how do you make sense of it all? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to systematize it and analyze it in a methodic way. So one of my colleagues at Notre Dame and I pulled together the data for provocations and the data for violence. We use provocations as a proxy for the precipitating event. In other words, what was an event that was emotionally strong? Something that would really upset people, right? Events, the precipitating event, and then the onset of violence. And I wanted to find out, really, in Sri Lanka, how much time do people have to intervene? And one of the ways that you can develop an early warning system with these kinds of data is you can use something called pattern recognition. And this is the kind of capacity that you're going to need in your secretariat and capacity that you're going to need in the nucleus program within country. They need to know how to do pattern recognition. They need to know how to assemble events data, how to build a crowdsourcing system and a trust network to get those data. Okay, the length of the lull. We analyzed the data. We used a methodology called survival analysis, which is an epidemiological methodology, something that people trying to identify when there's going to be an outbreak of disease use. And we found that for the eastern province, with the districts of Ampara, Batticaloa, and Trincomalee, I feel a little bit like a weatherman up here. It was on average overwhelmingly 2 days or less between the precipitating event and the onset of violence. 2 days or less. Now, we can't generalize that to all kinds of violence because, frankly, gang violence might have a totally different time frame than a separatist revolt violence, right? So you have to be careful what is the kind of category and what is a prototypical delay. Well, the delay in the eastern province was 2 days or less, overwhelmingly 2 days or less, between a precipitating event and the onset of violence. In Colombo, it was on average 5 days. So we don't really know why that's the case. It could be because there are more police and military in Colombo. More efforts to negotiate rather than just become violent. I don't know, but that's what we found. But it's interesting. I just want you to think about this. In places where you're trying to promote peace and you create an early warning system and all you have is 2 days at the most usually probably during the day or at the beginning of the second day to respond, you need people in your clubs who can intervene. You've got to have that capacity. You can't expect that you're going to drive to the other side of Kenya or in this case the other side of the island of Ceylon. I mean you've got to have people there locally who can start working on preventing something from blowing up because it happens quickly. This is all the more reason, these lines right here are all the more reason that an organization like Rotary has such unique potential to have an impact on peace. There's not much time. Okay, there are some ethical considerations here, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'll go through these quickly. But as I worked on this book that some of you have read, I came up with some of these. They're not in my book, but I just had to think through them, and I came up with five ethical considerations. Number one, people who crowdsource in very insecure environments could be treated with harm if they're found out. You know, sometimes the people in Sri Lanka that were working with the Foundation for Coexistence, they would send information in that really was pretty much military intelligence. There's a Tamil renegade group from the north about ready to attack a village. They were showing up last night. They're camped out over in this location. So they're sending that information to Colombo for their early warning system. Well, what happens if, you know, the people in that militant group find out that they've been sending that information? Well, they're put in danger. So the bottom line is that if you're going to engage people in collecting data, maybe crowdsourcing with text messages and that sort of thing, make sure that the likely benefit of preventing violence is greater than the danger they're putting themselves in to, you know, to send in the information. The second ethical question here is, be prepared to take action before you have perfect information. You know, if you wait around for perfect information, you're going to be too late. You know, it's a matter of, it's kind of like if you've studied the, you know, game theory, the prisoner's dilemma, where the prisoner doesn't know if the other person is going to rat on him or not. Well, this is a situation, you don't really know whether it's going to become violent or not, but you better take action because you're not going to know for sure. If you know for sure that there's going to be violence or not, then violence is happening. So you've got to get good at making decisions quickly on the spot to intervene. Another consideration is, you know, as my sister-in-law would say, keep it simple, stupid. In other words, don't get too sophisticated to the point where you're spending more of your time on methodology and computers and smartphones and iPads and all of that kind of stuff. The most difficult part of these systems is not the technology. It's not even the ability to issue a warning. The most difficult part is liberating local capacity. Liberating the capacity of people to go in and either intervene and try to prevent violence from happening or to safeguard a group by evacuating an area. You know, you have to work with people to understand what it's best to do. Do you want to negotiate with these people, or are they going to just start killing people, and in which case, is there a place where you can flee? And if so, how are you going to flee? You'll see a refugee, an internally displaced persons camp or a refugee camp here in just a little bit. Keep in mind how vulnerable some of these people are sometimes. You know, they don't have walls around them. They're living in huts. They're all concentrated. They have no way to protect themselves. Do you want to negotiate when the Janjaweed is coming off towards your camp and they've been killing people in village after village? Do you really want to negotiate with them? No, you probably don't. You probably want to evacuate, and you want to do it in a dispersed way so that you're not concentrated. If you're going to try to use nonviolence to bring about greater justice, just like Gandhi was trying to do, and his Muslim friend Abdul Zafar Khan, who did that in Peshawar, which was then British India, it's now Pakistan, there is a Muslim Gandhi. If you're going to do that, if you're going to try to bring about nonviolent change, you better have a handle on how to prevent the troublemakers from creating violence. Because as soon as violence starts breaking out in a tense situation, you're going to get more violence and you're going to discredit the movement. So you really need to use early warning and early response. And thank goodness we have things like social media with cell phones where we can communicate quickly. We've got a break-in at the museum here in Egypt. We've got this person who's come unglued over here in this part of Lebanon. You can then get it on top of this and try to prevent as much violence as you can. Otherwise, the use of nonviolent techniques is rendered worthless because people start becoming violent and you don't have credibility anymore vis-a-vis the military or the police. Your nonviolent movement is ruined. Finally, this is the refugee or internally displaced persons camp. I mean, look at how vulnerable these people are. Imagine, you know, when I was with Catholic Relief Services or when I was with American Refugee Committee, you would go into these camps and you would scope out, okay, what are their needs? They need water. We've got standards, they're called sphere standards. This many people in the camp, this many gallons or liters of water a day is what you're going to need. This many latrines are what you're going to need. This amount of food is what you're going to need, et cetera, et cetera. And then we go in, you know, Catholic Relief Services takes the water, Save the Children takes the healthcare clinics, Oxfam America takes on the food, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees brings in financial support. The blue helmets are running around from the UN, you know, the UN peacekeepers who wear blue helmets, and everybody's sitting there and they think, wow, you know, we've got people all over the world are here in solidarity with us. We're in a great situation. And then as soon as the militant groups start showing up on the horizon, most of the expatriates, the foreigners, are called out, because their organizations feel a liability that they sent the foreigners in there. They don't want them to get killed. So all these people that have been benefiting from the food and the water and the health care and everything else start to get left behind. They had felt some degree of security. And there's this new innovation in the world. It's called the responsibility to protect. And it's a great thing. But what I'm saying here with this ethical principle is that equally important, if not more so, is the responsibility to prepare. Prepare for the day that you're leaving that camp so that they can help themselves, so that they know how to flee in ways that aren't dangerous, so that they know how to feed themselves, to get water to drink, to get their medicine. It's a responsibility to prepare. You know, these people are vulnerable. You know, American Refugee Committee, after the Vietnam War, were working with, I think they were Cambodian refugees, and what they would do is they would bury tuberculosis medicine away from the camps so that if the camp was going to get attacked, they knew where to get the medicine as they were evacuating. The responsibility to protect is also needs to be coupled with the responsibility to prepare, to help these people be ready. Okay, these were my best teachers. These were the wonderful people with the Foundation for Coexistence. And this is my wonderful wife, Sue.
Thank you, Joe. We have a few minutes for questions that I already have here, and I have actually two questions that relate to the case studies. So the first one would be, in a situation such as Sri Lanka, how do Rotary clubs avoid becoming part of the white noise?
You know, the white noise is the reporting of a conflict and the confusion of trying to pull it all together in a coherent way. I think that, you know, if the Rotary clubs can provide the capacity to keep track of what's going on and to methodically analyze it and then communicate with people about what's going on, that's a huge service in and of itself. So I think they would be people who are actually not creating white noise. They would be people creating useful information out of the white noise by creating an early warning and an early response system.
One of the issues is that violence can take place years later in response to an event. For example, 9/11. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I think that's part of the human condition. You know, I think we try as much as we can to overcome some of these problems, but it's never going to be perfect. You know, this is a little bit off answer to that, but there was a in South Sudan, there was an attack by one tribe against another, and there were peace builders there and the army of South Sudan, and they called for an evacuation. There were about 50,000 people there. Over 40,000 got away. A lot of cattle were stolen, and women and children were killed, mainly. And I guess what I'm saying is, this is an imperfect, enterprise. It wasn't a perfect example of when early warning and early response worked, but it was worked completely, but it worked pretty well. It saved over 40,000 people's lives. Even though we could all kind of look at the fact that, well, it didn't save everybody's lives, and of course that's tragic in and of itself. But we have to be realistic about what we're able to do. You know, the human condition is such that people will remember. There are a lot of people, I know we have some faculty members here today from Portland State. You probably know a lot more about restorative justice than I do. The way that you, in a sense, have a purging of the poisonness of what memory can be is through restorative justice. You try to restore things in ways that people will feel satisfied with the situation. So I guess I would just say that, you know, those kinds of things are going to happen, and we just have to be aware that they will. One of the biggest challenges, you know, we talked earlier about drama, about the humanities. One of the biggest problems in a lot of these societies, just like in the Balkans, little children learn hate songs. Little children learn hate songs. And we've just got to be real careful to help our societies see that these songs where we're demonizing another group are not good.
We have a whole set of other questions, and as I mentioned earlier, we will address them in a written form. I apologize that we can't get to all of them. So now I would really like to thank Dr. Bock for his comments and for his presentation and the remarkable 1.5 days I was able to spend with him and talk. And maybe a round of applause here in the audience. And then I will ask Dr. Anastasiou, who opened our session today, to come back up and try to wrap it up for us. And also keep in mind we have that 2.5-minute video at the very end with Dr. Ann Frisch and Jody Williams. So,
I just want to say real quickly, I want to thank all of you for coming today, and I want to thank Rotary, the people of Rotary, for the invitation to do this. It's a real honor to be here with you, and it's an honor to be working with you. It's so amazing that you're doing this. So I really want to urge you to keep pressing forward. Thank you very much.
My task for now is to wrap up and give the highlights of what we heard. I'm not sure that is an easy task, given the diverse stories that we heard and the richness of what Joe gave us, but I will have a go. Obviously, we live in a very, very challenging world, but those challenges can also be turned to opportunities. Just to start my wrap-up, I would like to share a challenge that I faced this morning as I parked my car around the block to come to the event. As I was walking back, I saw 2 homeless people engaged in a very, very toxic conflict. And there I was, all dressed up, going to a peace workshop. From that moment until I entered the room, my mind was buzzing with what is my responsibility as a citizen, as a human being, as a Rotarian. But this is why what we heard today from Joe is extremely important and we should take cognizance of. So to wrap up and to simply highlight some of what we heard today, Joe presented us with the concept of early warning systems, that they are not new, that a number of them have been set up. But he also underscored the fact that the early response systems, they really lag behind. And that is where a lot of work needs to be done. He also stressed that early warning systems and responses are not simply the task of governments, of high-level institutions, but they are also the task of civil society, and that effective approaches have to be multi-level and cooperative. He described Rotary as civic glue, which I think is extremely significant for the task at hand to promote peace, because that civic glue can create the bridges, the connections, the associations, the partnerships to move forward in the interest of peace. He also mentioned the word audacity, which I think is extremely important. I tend to relate the word audacity to the word hope, because when you work in hope, you attempt to do what is over the horizon. You attempt to envision what is over the horizon. And that is what often gets us out of the circumstances that at the time may appear impossible to overcome. Rotary has extraordinary capacity, and the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, as Joe very well said, attempts to amplify this. We have the capacity to work horizontally as well as vertically. He also stressed the importance of cyberspace as being really a new frontier that can help promote peace. I found this quite fascinating, because if we look at the history of technology over the last 100 years, we are struck by the fact that technology has been hugely invested in violence and warfare, and yet so little of it has been invested in the interest of peace. So Joe's words, I think, resonate very, very true and very, very challenging. He also mentioned conflict situations and how important it is for the moderates within conflict situations to engage the extremists on their own side as a starting point to engage in dialogue and constructive engagement that would lead to peace. He mentioned Rotarians as mediators because of the advantage that the organization gives them, and the need to establish an international secretariat and to engage in risk assessments. He noted that we need also to deploy experts that can help amplify peace-building capacity within Rotary and in the areas that Rotary is involved in. We need to train and support Rotarians in the task of peace. And in many ways, this is what the Rotary Action Group for Peace is engaged in doing. He also stressed the importance of dialogue. Dialogue is really a key component to resolving conflicts non-violently. And that engagement always assumes a respect for the other, even the extremists, because the extremists often have legitimate grievances that need to be heeded. He also mentioned that along these paths, the Rotarian Action Group for Peace can learn to engage the powers, was the word. A very important challenge. He also emphasized that we should not shy away from being political, and that we should distinguish being political from being partisan. There is no way to engage in peace building without touching politics. It is really impossible. But the key is to remain non-partisan. He also stressed the importance of seeking partnerships, because the business of peace is nothing that any organization, human being, or group can do on their own. After all, peace and peace building is about relationship building. He mentioned the example of Rotary itself having conflict within it, when he mentioned the district in the Middle East involving Palestinians and Israelis. I have to say that I shared my part of that kind of conflict in Cyprus when we discovered that the Greek clubs were not talking with the Turkish clubs in the island. And if I may share a little bit more, in 2005, when I visited Cyprus with my class, Al Jubitz came along with me, and we visited the Rotarians on the two sides. And when we came back and informed Rotary International, they immediately sent a high-level Rotarian to the region who essentially negotiated a conciliatory beginning between the Greek and the Turkish Rotarians, which put them on a more constructive path. So even within Rotary, Joe reminds us, there is a lot of peace building to be done and to be undertaken. And then we had the test cases, which I think exemplify both the capacity to build peace, but also the diversity in doing so. The Klamath water right, I think, is exemplary of what Rotarians can do, and it's really a model to be emulated. The Rotary Peace Fellows we saw in Uganda, it gives us the potential that peace fellows who graduate from the Rotary Peace Centers can engage in, and how they can mobilize communities through the support of Rotary and work cooperatively with other organizations as well. And finally, the early warning system in Sri Lanka that Joe elaborated on gives us, again, more insight into how conflict prevention and nonviolence can be used to really liberate the capacity of the community, as he said. In concluding, I think it's important to reflect a little bit on the 4 simple directives that are really at the heart of Rotary culture, because I think in everything that we heard today, they resonate. And these are the 4, and this is the 4-way test that Rotarians should know. And I would like to simply recite them here, refer to them, because they are directives that I think converge with a lot of what we heard today. And they are posed in the form of questions as to how one moves forward. The first one is it the truth? The second one is it fair to all concerned? The third one, will it build relationships and friendship? And finally, will it benefit all concerned? If the answer to our engagements, to our culture, to our behavior, to our actions, to these questions, it's a yes, that is a very good sign that we are on the right path, building justice and peace in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. We will now watch a very short video that I mentioned with Dr. Anne Frisch and Nobel Peace Laureate Jody Williams.
So when I go to my local Rotaries and I speak at other Rotary clubs, I always ask them to join the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, because it's a way we have control. We're all Rotarians, but we also have a great deal of autonomy, and we can do projects, probably mostly not funded projects, but we can create relationships and let people know what's happening. And so I think the Rotarian Action Group for Peace is a great addition, because the other Rotary areas of focus, like water and sanitation, they have their Rotary action groups too. So I'm very happy to say that the Rotarian Action Group for Peace is now a reality and underway, and people are joining. And I'm looking forward to conversations across the world on very important matters of war and peace.
One of the things that I've been thrilled about is the movement of the Rotarians into looking at peace. I've been chatting with several of them lately that are colleagues and friends about that decision after the tremendous work on malaria to move into the world of peace. But I'm going to challenge Rotary to not just talk about the soft and fluffy parts of peace. If you really want to bring peace to the world, you have got to attack or tackle militarism. You can't just talk about, you know, if we educate everybody and just give girls a chance, we'll have peace. Those are components of peace, but if we don't look militarism in the face and talk about it and challenge our governments, I mean, the U.S. spends more on the military than all of the countries in the world combined. If we do not tackle that problem, we will never have peace. If we pretend that we're being defended, instead of saying, don't build killer robots in my name, don't build killer robots with my tax dollars. We have to start an honest discussion globally about, you know, why does war happen? It's institutions and individuals seeking power by sending other people's children to die. That's what war is. And it's always about power, resources, control. It is not about liberty, etc.
And with this, we conclude today's event. And I would like to thank everyone here in the room in Portland, Oregon. Again, for our online viewers, that's where we are. And our viewers in Portugal, the US Virgin Islands, Australia, Pakistan, Canada, and I believe a little group sitting in Hawaii right now too. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.